In the first of this second series of explorations together, we discussed what we saw to be our primary problem, our most pressing question: can we survive? We found the answer to be yes, if. And we found that this if is a threefold conditional. It sets for us three requirements if we are to get through. First, we must bring our goals into balance with our present powers. Otherwise, the blind repetition of a successful pattern of life must lead to our extinction. For we have specialized our minds and turned them into tools for taking things to pieces, in a search for more and more means, more and more power, at the cost of having less and less meaning, less and less purpose. Secondly, we must realize that we've been through the religious revolution, the political revolution, the economic revolution, and are now in the psychological revolution, and that victory in the present world struggle will go to those who best understand human nature. The third requirement set us, if we are to survive, is that we organize our manpower and our mind power into an organic social structure within which the individual can grow and which is headed by real seers, super scanners, who can convince us that we must change our present course of action in order to avoid the catastrophe which they can foresee by the exercise of prescience rather than by a reference to precedent. We then concluded that survival in itself would not be enough. If we were to go on, we must grow on. We must grow up to the terrific knowledge and vision that was necessary to our survival. Now, this problem of growth, which we're going to consider, is a problem of growth in the mind. For there has been a growth in the mind, and this we cannot now undo. Man's history does not repeat itself, although the generations of the animal species do go on repeating, till some chance mutation sends them onto another tack, or off the life tracks altogether into extinction. But man's history is the history of a growing mind. First, his consciousness was a shared consciousness, a co-consciousness. This was in his vast, primary human period, when almost as slowly as physical change, through scores of generations, man's slowly clearing vision gradually focused. An image of things, of the outer world, was produced, a tradition, while alongside an equal improvement in tools confirmed the truth of that vision and sustained that way of life. When, however, the instrument no longer helped confirm the inspiration, when the tool, as he made it more efficient, tempted man to think that he now had hold of reality, with that tool, which had now become a weapon, he challenged the vision, and it vanished, leaving as his prey the privileged blind tribal seers who had let their sight fail, and on whom he now turned, becoming a fighter, and projecting onto them all his frustrations at discovering the falsity of a senile tradition. From this vain search for relief, he next turned on himself. He had sacked the old civilization, and could not build and bind a new civilization of understanding. So, time and again, when the sword failed, when armed violence gave no security, but instead destroyed loyalty, men, as we know, fled to save themselves, by themselves, for themselves. In short, man had condensed into an individual. And there, we know, religion is still set. The inner life, the knowledge of eternal values, the realm of ends, is now confined to the individual and his private conscience. Consequently, man's moral convictions will not work in the outer world. And the realist is forced to ask this: how can there be any way of ruling mankind except by violence? At the same time, he is forced to face the fact that there is no other way of saving man's soul except by abandoning violence. We see, then, where lies our real problem. Our minds have grown. Our consciousness has intensified. We cannot go back. We cannot adjust. And further, this keen, critical mind can and does continually make finer tools with which to take the world to pieces and to release more force. Yet this mind cannot, because of its analytic partiality, compose and comprehend purpose. So inevitably it becomes increasingly skeptical. The gentle mind becomes pessimistic, the bitter mind cynical. We also know that owing to the technical critical success of this, the scientific method, our tradition, the cake of custom that holds us together, can no longer be trusted. The law, both civil and criminal, is based on precedent. And the basis of this precedent is the belief that all human law is a deduction from natural law. This assumption declares that it is natural for man to keep the laws of the courts, because if he breaks them, he is an unnatural beast. Yet this same civil and criminal law has long ruled that circumstances alter cases. Today, the premises on which our legal system was based have changed. That is, we can no longer assume that there is such a thing as natural law. And the present state of our mental growth now demands that we acknowledge the fact that there can be no ironclad, rigid laws in the outer world. Instead, there are hypotheses, penetrating insights and foresights. To live now by precedent is to try and anchor our behavior to a past already submerged. We must live not by precedent but by prescience, the hopeful forecast of the promise of our growth. To use a tired word with terrible exactitude, our age, our generation, is unprecedented. It has been without precedent for all of this century, but we would not attend to this when we might have thoughtfully considered it. When we found that precedent was no longer a safe guide, we should have and could have cultivated prescience, foresight, vision at our leisure. And remember that leisure does not mean being left with nothing to do. It means leave of absence from the present ground-level press to gain altitude and to be able to see what is coming on. In short, we have known for 2 generations that neither man's evolution nor his history repeats itself. We must go on. We cannot throw away our know-how, our industry. We must discover our know-why. We must assemble a contemporary knowledge of man's inner nature that will balance his powers. So now we cannot avoid seeing that our situation is unprecedented. We would not learn this through interest or even by concern, when the restoration of our balance would have been less difficult. Very well, we are now being forced to learn what unprecedented means, and learn it by the attention-commanding, spellbinding power of horror. Yes, in every other human crisis, in every other disaster of mankind, a remnant did live through it, did survive, did learn, did painfully build up again community, consideration, culture, civilization. Yes, in every other world cataclysm, when, for instance, in the Ice Age, outer nature turned against life and slew, annihilating all the mighty, destroying many species that had seemed for millions of years to be the growing favorites of the scheme of things. Even when desolation seemed everywhere, still when the million-year span of extermination was over, out of crannies and nooks there crept an overlooked might. And from it again, and not merely again, but higher than before, there rose the great tree of life, bearing new flowers and more wonderful, utterly unexpected fruit. And that is why our age is unprecedented. For this time, if we slip, we know that we can fall like Lucifer, never to hope again, never to rise again. And yet there is hope. And there is hope because man's consciousness is still growing. Hope, we all now know, seems almost unbelievable to those who are best informed of our danger, those whose job it is to know what our capacity for self-annihilation actually is. They have to deal with and to gauge the self-control, the wisdom. Alas, no. They have to estimate the fanatic bigotry, the blind lack of anything that could be dignified by the name of realism, which drives those who have the annihilatory violence already in their hands, and those many others who will have multi-megaton blasting power in their anarchist hands tomorrow. Yet, if we give as our reason for hope the possibility that the human consciousness is still growing, if there is no better hope than such a speculation, then this is an additional reason for despair. For surely it is just our damnable and fiendish ingenuity that has now left us cliff-hanging. I said a moment ago that we could have known, if we had wished, that we are unprecedented. We could, at our leisure, have prepared for this gigantic opportunity to give up living by precedent, which confines, and live by prescience, which liberates. And if we were to undertake the tremendous role of developing ourselves, we should be liberated. At last we should not only be equal to our conditions, but we should be able to be the intentional growing edge of life, the informed and enlightened leader of all the creatures. This great liberating and enlightening knowledge of prescience came as it should have come through our study of that which flows in us, the life current which has brought us to where we are, its furthest wave. A century ago, Darwin tested our self-esteem and reduced it. We had been regarding ourselves as a being that was divinely unique, a being that had really little or nothing to do with all the other creatures. True, our divinity had gotten into trouble. With the rise of the individual, we began to regard ourselves and our society as being fallen. Therefore, we should have to purge ourselves of this fall into animalism. We should have to flee the flesh and the world, desert society, and cast off our bodies so that after death we would enter a timeless, fleshless heaven. Darwin's discernment of the pattern of evolution, especially of man's ancestors, demonstrated that man is derived from an animal. Although Darwin's notion as to how this unheeding animal became a creature capable of moral judgments has proved to be flimsy. Freud's exploration of the subconscious showed that our minds and bodies are firmly bonded, and that repressing the appetites through a sense of guilt led to insane cruelties towards our fellows and ourselves, even though his speculations as to early man have proved to be grotesquely wrong. Thus it became necessary to make a further estimate of man, of ourselves. And this has led to two things. First, to the recognition of what Julian Huxley has rightly called the uniqueness of man. The plain fact, we now see, is that there is no animal that really resembles man. Man stands alone, literally, because he alone really stands upright. Man alone has a future because man alone is unfinished, and because he has no instincts. He therefore has the capacity to change his reactions whenever he will, and even more, he has the capacity to change himself at a speed which no other creature can approach. He is unconfined in the restrictions of race, the precedents of heredity, the compulsive uniformities of being a defined and limited species. The second recognition that a further estimate of man has led to is that this unique creature has reached a unique, unprecedented age and crisis. Up till now, humanity, since it shaped society for itself, has gone through a series of violent alternations. As man tried to express his society in a compact, political, traditional corporation, and to express himself as a lonely, psychophysical individual. But now, instead of epochs of activity and output, alternating with ages of interned withdrawal, and without losing grasp on the means whereby the body may be kept in health, we can, within a society that extends its hold on the outer world, explore the inner world, and that on which it opens out, the realm of ends. Man's progress need no longer be a series of spastic oscillations between raids into the beyond which is without and recoils into the beyond which is within. Man's growing consciousness can now advance outwardly and inwardly at one and the same time. But what is this, you will, it is hoped, exclaim at this point? This is sheer Pollyanna. What did you point out when we were discussing survival? Why, the actual tragic state of psychophysical health. And that even if the chaotic, paranoid public opinions of an anarchic world don't by chance bomb us all off the world's weary face, the indications are that the welfare society is collapsing from within. And didn't you tell us that just the bare fact of our progress in physical hygiene caused any hope of quality, that is of growth, to be drowned in a deluge of degenerate quantity? By unmindful use of medical advances, making millions of more people survive before we asked if and how they could be fed, haven't we made it highly probable that deaths by famine will increase by the million, and that those who do live will become degenerate starvelings, surviving only long enough to reproduce more mouths to consume and more hands less able to produce? While at the other end of the lifespan, are we not adding a similar load, the millions of the old, long past producing, long past getting or giving any happiness, who must, at ever-rising cost, absorb the resources of superb hospitals, devoted adult strength, and highly trained skill, that they may be kept alive in a state of senility? Yes, all this is quite true. And you may well bring up the further fact that in the traditional societies of precedent, the old were honored. They had their role. They served as guides, as seers, while in our society, they've never been such a load increasing every year, and never given so little towards the cost of their maintenance. No other society could have paid for what the old now demand and get. No other society has gotten less from, none has reaped more discouragement from this age group. So, you may ask, how can we have a healthy, not to say a forward-looking, vigorous society, when the bridge of life is blocked at the upper end by a jam of broken-down vehicles, which cannot advance and yet stubbornly refuse to make way? Is it any wonder that the young, with this woeful spectacle always before them, feel no respect, view with contempt the timid morality that results in such futility? and to decide, to enjoy their appetites, and break out and burn out, rather than end in this lamentable fiasco. Is not delinquent youth an inevitable reaction to delinquent age? And in reaction from the sight of these legions of the senile, are not increasing hosts of adults trying to return to childishness? Yes, this bitter charge must be faced, whether we see it as the worst and most grave of our blunders in upsetting the balance of nature, or whether we view it as the penalty exacted because we would not look before we leapt, because we would not learn that the unthought-out good is the worst enemy of the best, or even of the better. The fact remains that we have managed to make a vast miscarriage of the life process. Still, we know there must be growth, for evolution proves that growth is the nature of life, and the life record shows that there has been persistent growth. Further, as growth has gone on, that growth has become increasingly brain growth. This has meant an increasing growth of awareness, of consciousness. Survival is best secured by those creatures with the largest brains, by those who can think, by those who can grow in understanding. This is why the most advanced creatures are called the big-brained animals. For when you come to far the most advanced animal, the biggest-brained animal, man, we find that he does grow by his thinking. This thinking has put him far ahead of and above all the other animals. For he not only learned how to answer the questions which nature put to him, how to do those things necessary to survive, to make tools, grow crops, raise cattle, build houses, weave clothing, but at the same time he taught himself to ask why he should do these things, what all these things meant, what was the purpose for gaining these powers over his environment. And it was this reciprocating process between learning how and asking why that made advance possible. By alternatively catching sight of something odd and new, and then wondering what it signified, man's understanding enlarged as a balanced unit. The constant finding and calling attention to oddities was the natural function of the young. For their contribution was the gift of curiosity and play. Conversely, the contribution and gift of the old was to give order and design to these peculiar things and experiences, to show how they could be interpreted, and how, with due respect to the nature of these peculiarities and the nature of man himself, they might be used. Thus there was a balanced relationship between the individual's entire development and the development of his society. Instead of the individual being at a loss as to his social significance, and so beginning to feel that he was up against the state, society and its constituents were in play with each other. Each age group had its part in performing an absorbing drama. The old had the role of conductor. Out of their reflections and ponderings on life came inspiration for the younger. Today, however, the old are the greatest handicap. Far from being an inspiration, they are a prime cause of team discouragement. And physiology tells us that there is all too good ground for this profound misgiving. The usual statement made by those who, under the stately name of gerontologists, give to the press promises that soon swarms of centenarians will be assisting at making a community as advanced in wisdom as these ancients are in years, are indeed Pollyanna. The physiological fact is that the giant brain cells, on which all our intelligence depends, unlike most of our other cells, are never renewed. As a very wise and concerned biologist has said, if we do no more than just let our lives run out, we must all die imbecile, since the life within us, untaught as to how it may volatilize, drains down from its most advanced station, the forebrain, retreating, until only an automaton heartbeat keeps a living corpse from disintegration. Why has this befallen us? The answer is providentially quite clear, and we can act on it the moment that we will accept our responsibility to act on it. Our lives today end increasingly in senile futility because we will not have the courage to see that each of us must undertake for ourselves an intentional way of life, a series of steps whereby we may rise to a final culmination, not sink in a dismal collapse. We must act on our present knowledge of man's growth. And what is the most remarkable and valuable thing we have now learned about man? To realize that he is unique and unfinished is highly important, and this means that we must look ahead to what he may become, not look back and doubt as to whether an animal can ever transcend its animal nature. But we need to know even more than this, and we can. We can now know the way in which man has advanced, and the way, through that knowledge, in which he can, if he will, advance far further and far faster, yes, fast enough to outdistance his present peril.